and welcome to the sixth and final episode of Dojo Talk for 2020. This is the BA martial artist coming to you. If you've been following my blog this year, you are aware I've been focusing on different levels of perspective to understand your organization. We focused on the organization, the customer, process, business rules, systems, and we are wrapping up data. All of these areas help in understanding different aspects of the organization. This month, we are going to wrap up our focus on data with a final video cast. Today, I am joined with a fellow colleague of mine, Ian Hawkins, all the way from the UK. But before we get started with the video cast, a little bit about Ian. Ian Hawkins is a lifelong storyteller, an award-winning speaker, writer, and performer who has appeared on stages around the world. Born with a debilitating heart condition, Ian has gone on to have a fascinating and wide-ranging career, working closely with heads of state, Olympians, CEOs, and media figures. As a content creator, Ian was editor-in-chief at PEX Network, has written for top-rated programs on BBC TV and radio, and traveled the world producing documentaries on subjects from AI to ecology. With a unique take on how the world works, Ian uses data, anecdote, history, and humor to explore the subjects that interest him. Those subjects are science, mental health, technology, communication, motivation, and leadership. Often he finds surprising connections, historical precedents, and spots trends pointing towards future possibilities. His acclaimed book, Insider Secrets of Public Speaking, draws on his experience in the corporate speaking industry. Flexible, can-do, and always enthusiastic, Ian's warm and engaging style leaves audiences energized and involved. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the final episode of Dojo Talk for 2020, episode 6, with myself and Ian Hawkins. Welcome everyone to the sixth and final episode of Dojo Talk, where we'll be talking today about data. And I have a special guest and colleague and friend of mine, Ian Hawkins, who will be joining us to talk a little bit more about data. So thank you, Ian, for being here with me. I consider you a data guru based from my friend Robert Thacker, who said you are great in the data domain.
That's very kind of you, and that's very kind of Robert. We met online, obviously, because I'm in London and he's in the States, but we actually physically met in Dallas. And why we didn't call it Data Does Dallas is beyond me. There was such an obviously good line to call it. We haven't, but I'm claiming it now. Data Does Dallas.
All right, and this is recorded, so you've claimed it. It's recorded. It's yours.
Yeah, it's me. Boom! My rubber stamp straight on the top there.
Love it. So let's jump right in, shall we, and talk a little bit more about data. So when did you fall in love with data? Clearly, you have a passion for it, and why do you have such a passion for it?
I think data is one of those things that we all appreciate, but it's never front of mind. And I started working, with how I met Robert actually. I started working as the editor-in-chief of PEX Network for IQPC. And PEX Network is process excellence. And a lot of it was about data, how people use data to make their businesses run better. And my boss at the time said to me, look, Ian, he said, it's a very dry subject. And I said, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. Data is one of those things that if you get it wrong, it drives you crazy. And if you get it right, maybe you don't notice it. But for me, I think it's really important. And for me, I think the reason that I started getting into data, I really enjoyed it and see what it could do, was I was born with congenital heart disease. And I am so lucky to have been born when I was, because a generation previously, the mortality rate of what I have was something like 90%. If you were born with my condition, 9 times out of 10, you were not going to reach adulthood. And I came along, medical history had advanced to the point that it is starting to flip. And my consultant's a woman called Jane Somerville, and she became a pediatric cardiologist just because being a woman at that time in cardiology, which was very much an old boys club, And nobody wanted to touch pediatrics with a barge pole because the stats were so bad, and you were going to spend your life explaining to parents why their child was going to die. And she saw that as this opportunity to actually flip the model. And so now it's something like a 90% survival rate, and Jane is mostly responsible for that. And so I was interested in how data, which most people see as a bunch of numbers that has no meaning, how it actually, if you apply it properly, it can be incredibly impactful, quite emotional, and very personally, extraordinarily beneficial.
Wow, what a story. So that's why you're so passionate about it, because it's essentially data saved your life.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
I could tell you all kinds of amazing things about Jane Somerville, but she's very Googleable, and she's all over Wikipedia. So I would massively encourage you to look her up. She was on the team that did the first heart transplant in the United Kingdom. Now, the first one was in South Africa, Christian Barnard. The second one was over here. She was the chief physician, and the surgeon who performed that operation ended up performing surgery on me. So I have a celebrity thorax, if you like. Whenever I talk to anybody in cardiology now, I always say, guess who did this? Paul Ross. And they go, no. And yeah.
Wow.
A little bit of the golden hands of Paul Ross has been rooting around inside my chest.
That is pretty awesome. What a story. What an inspirational story, actually. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked a little bit about the benefits of data, but let's go a little bit deeper on that. How can data help individuals understand their organizations better, understand how their organizations are structured, how the data flows, how they can use that data potentially to help make decisions, anything around that?
Well, Paul, I think that the data is the slap around the chops that everybody needs, because the problem that you have when you're running a business or an organization is that you are extraordinarily vulnerable to believing your own publicity. And we all are very flawed human beings, and we have these cognitive biases, these beliefs that we come up with and that we don't apply data to. Okay? It's confirmation bias. We only see what we want to see. And we can think of loads and loads of profound examples of how that works in the real world. Data, when you get hold of data, it actually tells you things that you don't necessarily want to hear, but that you have to know if you're going to make your business work properly. So let's think of a really good example. Business process management. My definition of a business process is anything you do at work. Okay, whether it's flipping a hamburger or filling in an invoice. Now, say that process takes you 2 hours to achieve. Okay, a business process management can come in and look at all the data and says it takes you 10 minutes to do that, it takes you half an hour to do that, it takes you 20 minutes to do that. If we do this differently and that differently and move this around, and we can shrink that down, and it suddenly makes your process a lot more efficient. So using data all the way through that process just reinforms what you're doing and helps you do things better and smarter. As a business leader, obviously you need to know if what you're doing here, you're investing X amount of money here, and it's having this amount of impact on your bottom line. Is that worth spending the money on? And that other kind of data, that's incredibly useful for you as a business leader to work out that the money you're spending is having an effect. Because sometimes the warp and the weft of how a business works can be incredibly subtle, and you don't know whether investing in that new computer has made everything quicker, or if your team just happened to have a nicer day that day and just were a bit speedier working on it. You need to have the data, because with the right data, real life cannot get in the way and hide.
Very true, very true. Which you gave a great segue right into my next question, which is a hot topic that a lot of people are hearing about right now, and that is data analytics. So, what is this thing called data analytics?
Data analytics pretty much is taking all the data and finding the story in it. I've just realized that I have a really good example hanging on the wall behind me. This is it's like a map of London, and it's made up of all these different place names. Okay.
Okay.
Now, if I were to give you all of these place names, and they were just like a list of names, they wouldn't have any meaning. Okay.
Right.
So you'd go, if I were to say, can you get me from Wapping to Piccadilly Circus? You just have a list of names. You wouldn't know where they are. Okay. Now, what we've done here is we've kind of put them into a map. So you can see that white line running through. I know because I live here. You might not, but that is the River Thames. And so all of these place names are in the right place. So suddenly if I say, well, how do you get from Wapping to Piccadilly Circus? You could start plotting a route out here. You could go, oh, right, I'm in Wapping. I need to go to Tower Gateway, Tower Hill, Bank, St. Paul's, Barbican, and you can find your way through. That is what data analytics does. It takes all of your data and puts it in a shape that you can understand and that you can work from. Does that make sense, Paula?
It makes total sense. So it's really just taking something that's just words and putting it into a story so that you can understand really what those words mean. So great understanding on data analytics and how you take the data and you analyze it and what the high level understanding of data analytics is. There's a lot deeper concepts and terminology in data analytics, which we won't get into here. But moving on a little bit around data and analytics, just to get a little bit more for those individuals who might just want a little bit more on it. What would you say some of the key techniques and fundamental concepts are around data analytics?
So some of the data can tell you lots of different things. So it can be very descriptive. So let's take the weather for an example. So a descriptive analytic would say it's raining right now. Okay. Here I am in SW9 in London. It is raining right now. There'd be a diagnostic analytics, which wouldn't say if it's raining. It would say there is heavy cloud. There is this kind of wind. It's this different sort of cloud. So it might produce rain. There is prescriptive analytics, which would say it has rained 3 inches in SW9 in the last 24 hours. Okay, that's a slightly different way of looking at it. Exploratory analytics would say, I live in a particularly rainy part of the world. It might say your chances of getting wet on any one day are 6 in 10, or 40%, or whatever that might happen to be. Predictive analytics would say, Ian, take an umbrella out with you. Mechanistic analytics would be is the big picture stuff. What factors are going to make a difference over whether it's raining or not. So there's all these different ways of looking at the rain, for just for one example, and you can apply these to different things that are happening in your business. So, for instance, the big piece of data that everyone has is how much profit did we make, or how much are we spending. And other things can come along like that. So how is COVID affecting this? Is having to give everybody in the office a computer of their own. That's going to affect us. How is productivity going to be hit by working from home? So all these different analytical techniques can be brought in, and they'll all have this knock-on effect. So again, it depends on how you slice the pie on what comes out. But I fundamentally think that the more you understand about data, the better placed you are to understand what's really going on and to avoid all those cognitive biases.
So essentially taking all those different perspectives you just talked about, diagnostic, prescriptive, predictive, and looking at it from all those different perspectives, all tell a story. And that story, when you put all that together and you analyze those stories, can be very informative on what's going on. And it can also tell you some maybe underlying root causes of some of the issues or concerns you might be seeing, or trends and patterns you might be seeing in your organization that you may or may not like.
Yeah, one of the big things for me is, I mean, I'm talking about data, but one of the big metrics I think that is really important, especially for running a team, is happiness. And because a happy team is going to work harder, they're going to be more enthusiastic, they're going to be more productive. The problem is, how on earth do you measure happiness? And there's probably an art form all in itself. But I bet you if you get it cracked, unhappiness is telling you something. It's telling you a really important story. And if you're leading an unhappy team, one, you're making your life really hard work for yourself. But two, that's not a team that's working at the top of their game.
Right.
So I think getting those bits of data right are really important. And for me, happiness is the big metric. And I can't tell you, Paula, how many conversations I've had with people about mental health in the last 6 months that would not have happened in the last, in 2019, just because, we didn't think about it then. But suddenly everybody has realized that mental health is not something that you switch on and off. It's a gradient, and we have very poor ways of understanding it and very poor language around it, and we need to understand it in a much more useful way, so that we can go, aha, right, let's push ourselves back down towards the mental health and the happy route, because we're drifting. And I sincerely think that when people do manage to get back into the offices and we have a return to normal work-wise, it's going to be one of those things that people start monitoring and measuring more. And there's going to be an awful lot more sit-downs with bosses going, you're right, is there something you want to talk about?
Mm-hmm. No, so very true. I'm seeing it more and more. If anything, 2020, though it has been a rough year, I do believe 2020 has been a pivotal year, a transitional year. It's opened up Pandora's box on many issues that were not looked at, that were glazed over. And because of that, now when we go into 2021 and beyond, our new normal is going to be a very much different. I don't believe everything that we did prior to 2020 is actually going to go into 2021. I do believe we're going to have some things that will, and there's going to be some things that are going to be new. So I 100% agree. I've seen it here as well, that there's conversations that should have been happening that haven't been. And so we need to focus on that.
Yeah, because I think people are very much in there. I think people are very welded to this idea that just because I believe it, it must be true. And I know that it's a very difficult thing to have to admit that you're wrong. But I see so many things in the world where you want to just go, what's happened? What metrics are you using? What data is informing your decision? And ultimately, of course, it's not data. It's emotion. People are making very emotional decisions.
Right. When you look at, you have your perception, and then when you look at what's actually happening through the data that comes out, the information that comes out, how that can actually change your perspective. Because now you've got that data backing it, and what might have been your reality may not really be your reality.
Yeah. It's the hardest thing to admit that you're wrong, I think, especially if you put so much emotional heft behind being right. But ultimately, I think the truth has to come out, and there will ultimately always be a reckoning. And when you have people literally in a hospital bed with COVID saying that they still think it's a hoax, even as the doctor is advancing on them to intubate them, then you have to say to yourself, okay, the human brain is amazing at fooling itself. And what is it that's going to make you, going to change your mind? And ultimately, it has to, without wanting to be a sort of Mr. Spock or a Sheldon Cooper about this, you have to say, it's the data. I don't care how much you don't like it, but that data is telling you something.
Right, right. So do you feel there is a certain role that should conduct data analysis on a project or in an organization?
I think it's horses for courses. I think it depends on the organization who gets to do the data. But my feeling is that you need to have whatever data comes up and however it's analyzed, it needs to be understood. And it needs to be collaborated and communicated effectively. What you don't want to happen is somebody just to go, well, this is what the data says, but that's just the data, Also, you don't want the data tail wagging the strategy dog at the same time. So you need to have the two things working together. Now, the way I always think of it is we can all jump in a car and drive to the shops. Okay, not a problem. We don't necessarily understand how an internal combustion engine works. So that is kind of like the data side of it, understanding how the engine works. That doesn't mean that because you understand how the engine works means that you can drive that car more safely than anybody else. Data is just something that has a huge role to play in any organization. But it is one part, and there's lots of other things that are going on as well. So you have the guy behind the wheel, and somebody else reading the map, and somebody else that understands that you don't put orange juice in the gas tank. And these things all have to come together, and they all have to work. I think it is the responsibility of leadership to make sure that the data is being used properly and that the right people are on it.
Good. Very good. Good. And so, like you said before, some people like data and some people don't. So if you don't particularly like data, you may not thrive trying to do data analytics or capturing data because you just have no sort of interest in it. But how about for those people who are kind of forced to do it, who don't have an interest in it? Is there any pieces of advice you can give them on how do they maintain and get through it?
This is emotional stuff, isn't it? Because look, I've just gone through a diet myself, and I don't like being hungry, and I don't like eating, I don't like eating tomatoes when I'd much rather have a ham sandwich. So you kind of have to say, what is my goal? What am I aiming for? And however much you dislike doing the data, and of course, if you're in a leadership position, you can farm some of it out, but you have to understand what the benefits are, and that's the cost is that you might find it dull or you might find it difficult. Outsource what you can, but don't lose sight of the fact that actually that data is giving you something really, really helpful. Is that useful, Paula?
That is very useful. And that actually goes into my last question, which is one piece of advice that you would like to leave with this audience today concerning data. Now, you gave us a really great nugget right there. Understand the benefit. Why are you looking at this data? That is awesome in itself. But is there any other piece of advice, as you've worked in the data world for so long and you've done a lot of work in this space, is there one piece of advice you would love to leave with the audience here around data?
I think you have to manage your relationships with other people, and you have to manage your relationship with data. There's that old saying, isn't there? Trust but verify. That is brilliant for building relationships. I think it's absolutely deadly for data, because if you just trust, if you're trusting and verifying with data, all that's happening is you're just looking at the data that confirms your cognitive biases and your confirmation bias. You need to have a much broader view of data. You need to be open to hear bad things. You need to be aware of that dashboard that is going to say, it's going to flash a red warning light at you, and you're going to pay attention to it because you have to, and you're not going to ignore it just because you kind of don't want to. So that's it. My takeaway is, if you're not hearing the occasional bit of bad news, you have to wonder whether it's actually whether the problem's with you.
I see. That's great. That's great. Well, Ian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. You gave us great information. It was a great conversation. It was great to hear your story, your personal story on how data is really personable to you. And so I definitely appreciate that. And to my audience, thank you for joining me this year in all of these different video casts. I'll be coming back in 2021 with more. I don't know what all the topics are going to be yet, but we will continue on. And I hope you have enjoyed this last episode of Dojo Talk for the 2020 season. Ian, thank you again.
Thank you, Paula. It's been a huge pleasure.
Thank you.